if you want to talk about what's causing flow, right, in the brain, you want to talk about three things: neuroanatomy, right, where in the brain is something taking place; neurochemistry and neuroelectricity, which are the two ways the brain communicates. So the first change is neural anatomical. And the old idea here is what's called the 10% brain myth. The old idea was that we're only using 10% of our brain, but ultimate performance, AKA flow, has to be the full brain on overdrive, right? Turns out we had it exactly backwards. In flow, it's not that parts of the brain are becoming hyperactive, they're actually deactivating, they're starting to shut down. The technical term is transient hypofrontality. Transient meaning temporary, hypo, H-Y-P-O, it's the opposite of hyper, it means to slow down, to deactivate. And frontality is the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that houses your executive function, all your higher cognitive functions. And this explains a lot of like the strange phenomenological qualities of flow. For example, why does time pass so strangely in flow? The technical term is time dilation. It means it either slows down and you get that freeze frame effect I had while surfing, or it speeds up and 5 hours will pass by in like 5 minutes. It's because time is calculated all over the prefrontal cortex. So when parts of it start to shut down, right, when the prefrontal cortex becomes hypofrontal, it can no longer perform the calculation, and we can no longer separate past from present from future, and we're plunged into what researchers call the deep now, which is a very like fully present state, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's neuroanatomical. I talked about neurochemistry, right? These 5 extremely potent neurochemicals, and they're the 5 most potent pleasure drugs the brain can produce. And flow seems to be the only time the brain produces all of them at once. So when you say it's the kind of the most potent drug on earth or the most addictive state on earth, you're not actually exaggerating. The neurobiology underneath it kind of bears this out, which is also why, researchers refer to flow as the source code of intrinsic motivation. Because once an experience starts producing flow, like my surfing experience, right? It didn't matter how sick I was, you will go extraordinarily far out of your way to get more flow. And the last bit is brain waves, right? The neuroelectricity. And normal waking consciousness is a beta wave, right? It's a fast moving wave. That's kind of where we are when we're just kind of up thinking, having this conversation. Flow is a much slower wave. It actually takes place at the borderline between alpha, which is sort of the daydreaming state, where you're not really attaching to thoughts and you're going from idea to idea without a lot of internal resistance, and theta. Theta only shows up when we're dreaming or right as we're falling asleep in that hypnagogic state. So flow actually exists on kind of the borderline between alpha and theta. And if you want to kind of talk about what is flow, right, I always start with these neurochemicals, this changes to brain waves, and this alteration in processing, right? And the prefrontal cortex shuts down. That's kind of that's the current scientific definition of what is a flow state.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, because we talk about all 3 of those in different perspectives, and it seems like they all tend to coincide. Do you have is there an instinct or an understanding as to which one of those is first? Like what gets triggered first? Is it the chemicals?
It's a great question. So first of all, let's back out for half a second, because the last point you made is totally right. We now know that it's not just flow, it's any altered state of consciousness, right? That's what we're talking about here. Flow is just one variety, but all these changes, and there are subtle differences, right? Meditation and flow both produce transient hypofrontality, but in meditation, there's a portion of your brain called the orbital medial prefrontal cortex that governs creative self-expression, right? Creative decision-making. In meditation, it's shut down. It's totally turned off because you don't need it, right? You're trying to block out self. In flow, which is this massively heightened state of near perfect decision making, where all you're doing is making great creative decisions after great creative decisions, and so much so one is leading to the next, the experience feels flowy, which is where its name comes from. That portion of the brain is actually hyperactive. So there are changes, really, specific changes between one and the other. But as to your question, it's a giant puzzle. No one is exactly certain what comes first, what changes first. And to make matters even more complex, it may vary experience to experience to experience. Right? Like when action adventure sport athletes get kicked into flow, oftentimes they're riding a massive dopamine high, right? And dopamine is kind of one of the brain's principal reward drugs, but it's also a very powerful focusing mechanism. And it shows up whenever we take a risk. So these guys jump off something, dopamine floods into their system automatically because it shows up when we take a risk. And if the risk is taken in very uncertain conditions, like skiing or snowboarding, backcountry kind of conditions, it's even more dopamine. They ride that into the zone. But there's lots of other different kind of entrance points into flow. People, creativity drives you into flow, and then so the triggers may differ from situation to situation, and they may differ genetically. You may be more susceptible to certain triggers and certain entrance ways than other people. So there's no good answer to that, but I will say my organization, the Flow Genome Project, what we are working on right now, one of our big research projects, our main one, is a biophysical based flow detector. And as of right now, the way it's looking, and it's not totally built yet, we haven't dialed it in. You can't measure neurochemistry in the brain as a general rule, but certain neurochemicals you can look at outside of the brain. Norepinephrine, for example, pupil dilation correlates with norepinephrine. So we're going to use that coupled with really good EEG brainwave stuff that can also possibly look at a little bit of the transient hypofrontality stuff. So we're starting to poke at ways to get at this.
Yeah.
And we're looking at other kind of biophysical correlates that may stack up as well.
If what you've heard on Flow Research Collective Radio has been helpful, please consider doing us a solid and leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you are listening to this. Reviews help us connect to a wider audience so we can get these peak performance principles out to more people.